Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started just to make sure that we get done in time for your next class. I know how concerned and worried you are about that. So I'm going to start off today by talking about the Supreme Court. There is an assignment that was just posted to your Google Classroom. That's just a quick question. I'm asking for about 2 to 3 sentences in a response. If you pay attention to the presentation, you should be able to answer it straight off. I would advise you that when we get done here, to just immediately get on, answer it, and just be done with it. It's a quick and easy 25 points for your answer there. So again, 2 to 3 well-developed sentences, and you should be good to go. After I'm done sharing my screen and presenting, Ficker and Miss J will also be presenting the weekly assignments for you on the judicial branch. So please stay put for that. So again, I'm going to share my screen as soon as I figure out which one. There it is. All right, so the Supreme Court. We've been talking a little bit about the court system. You had the basics last week. This week, we're going to talk about landmark Supreme Court cases in one of your assignments and how the federal judiciary works in one of your other assignments. What my job here today is to talk about the federal Supreme Court, specifically the justices that are on it. There are 9, and according to our Constitution, according to Article 3 of the Constitution that sets up the judicial branch, they serve for life. So these are lifetime appointments. That's why people take them so serious, because theoretically, if somebody, let's say, lives to be 90 and they get on the court when they're 45, you're talking about possibly half their life being spent on the Supreme Court. So they can influence policy, they can influence legislation and whether or not it becomes law. They can certainly strike down state laws, they can influence social policy, they can do a number of things on the Supreme Court. So it does become rather important that these people have this job, these people have this job for as long as they do. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that matters here today. So the current Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices, and the current Supreme Court, quite honestly, is more diverse than they typically are. Okay. Typically the Supreme Court is way more homogenous than this. This is probably the most diverse Supreme Court we've ever had. I know that doesn't seem like much because you still have 5 white males on it, but it used to be 9 white men, and it was 9 white men for the majority of our history here. It's only recently that we've started to see some diversity on the court. Now, the diversity of the court, at least physically, pales in comparison to the concern people have about the diversity of ideology, whether they are conservative or liberal. If you remember at the very beginning of the year, we talked about the differences between conservative or right-leaning and liberal left-leaning. If you remember, the conservatives were typically Republicans, the liberals were typically Democrats. And so obviously who nominates the justices to the Supreme Court does matter a great deal in that, but it also matters about who the Senate is willing to listen to, who the Senate is willing to confirm. And we're going to talk about why that's controversial here in a few minutes when we talk about these justices. So starting off, the first justice we're going to talk about is the Chief Justice John Roberts. John Roberts took his seat back in 2005. He was a George W. Bush or Bush 43 appointee. He came directly into the court and immediately ascended to the Chief Justice position because of a weird scenario where Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first female on the Supreme Court, had announced her retirement. Sandra Day O'Connor had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and was worried that that would slowly be a problem on the Supreme Court. So she wanted to retire before that was really an issue. And Sandra Day O'Connor did wonderful things after she left the court. She started iCivics, which being one of the founding members of that, we as government teachers use that quite often, and you have played video games on that website to teach governmental policy and civics. So she's done an amazing job in her career in law, but also in education now as well. Well, Sandra Day O'Connor decided she wanted to retire. Her husband was also going through some health issues as well at the time. And so John Roberts had been tapped by George W. Bush to take over. But during that nomination phase, Chief Justice William Rehnquist died of cancer very suddenly. And when he died, George W. Bush decided that not only will John Roberts be on the court, he'll be leading the court, which is not without precedent. This has happened before. They have had people who are not justices jump immediately to the Chief Justice position. But because John Roberts was very young at the time, and keep in mind, if he took his seat in 2005, he would have been about 50 years old at the time. So as I said before, what if John Roberts, let's say, lives to be 90? He's going to have 40 years on the court if he chooses to stay the entire time. So he's going to have a very large influence, and he may be one of the longest serving Chief Justices in American history. So, depending upon his health and depending upon how much he wants to do the job, he could be there for a very long time. Now, he is a Harvard graduate, both in his undergrad and in his law school. And like I said, he's currently 66 years old. So he's been on the court for 15, 16 years now. And certainly has influenced some policies. Now, being nominated by Bush, you would think, all right, well, Bush is a Republican, so obviously he's a conservative. And that's certainly what Bush thought. But Bush has been surprised because Roberts has actually tendered some fairly liberal votes as well. And he was the swing vote, as it's known, on Obamacare. When the Affordable Care Act was up in front of the Supreme Court, a lot of conservatives thought, all right, well, we'll strike it down 5-4 because they had a 5-4 conservative majority. It ended up being Roberts that actually swung it back towards the liberals on the court by calling it a tax, which wasn't exactly the decision that Obama wanted completely, because now he was always going to be tagged with, well, he raised taxes, not exactly something a president wants to have next to their name. But by doing so, at least Obama has that piece of legislation, which if you read his book, The Promised Land, that's, I know Ficker's read it and I'm in the middle of reading it as well. He talks very highly about that. That is what he is most proud of about pretty much anything he ever did in the White House. So had the Supreme Court struck that down, that would have been highly irritating and crippling towards the Obama administration. So by Roberts allowing that to continue on and become policy, and become somewhat rooted in American governance and society, Roberts has allowed for his crowning achievement to continue. Needless to say, he still is considered to be fairly conservative. He has rendered decisions with the conservative majority recently, so we'll see how this plays out. Now, the longest serving justice on the Supreme Court, not the oldest, but the longest serving, is Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was nominated back in 1991 by Bush Sr., Bush 41. He is a graduate of Holy Cross as an undergraduate. Now, part of the reason that he went to Holy Cross, which is not a bad school, don't get me wrong, but it's not an Ivy League school, is that Clarence Thomas did have issues with racial discrimination when he was going through his schooling. So he has not exactly had the easiest ride through his schooling to get to this position. He did manage through hard work and dedication to get to Yale, but even his ascendancy to the court was not easy. It was controversial because while he was being nominated by Daddy Bush in 1991 to replace Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African-American on the Supreme Court, and he was retiring at the time, Clarence Thomas was accused during the nomination phase of sexual harassment by a former female law clerk. And this became very public, and it was really the first very public, very controversial sexual harassment claim against a government official, which certainly clouded his nomination. He still managed to survive that and become a member of the Supreme Court, and he has been one of the more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. He also is one of the quietest. He doesn't talk very much. He very rarely asks a question. And when Ficker goes through kind of how the Supreme Court operates, he loves to talk about how during the process, the one side presents their claim, another side presents their claim, and then the justices have the right to ask questions. And the other 8 justices will ask a tremendous amount of questions. They will, pepper both sides with clarifications or questions about, well, what if this or what if that? Thomas never does. He just sits there. He's probably coughed more into the microphone than he has asked questions over the course of his tenure, because he believes that both sides present their case, and he decides based upon that by asking questions, he feels like he would influence the verdict. Excuse me. So needless to say, Clarence Thomas, a little different and very conservative in his judicial mindset. So he has lived up to the Bush 41 expectations ever since taking the role of a justice on the Supreme Court. Now, one of the oldest is Justice Stephen Breyer. Breyer is a Clinton appointee, so since he's nominated by Clinton, Clinton being a Democrat, you would expect him to be liberal, and he has been. This was a liberal swing when he was put on the court because he replaced a guy named Harry Blackmun, who was a Nixon appointee. Now, notice Breyer went to Stanford, which is no slouch of a school out on the West Coast in California, and he went to law school at Harvard. And again, he's kind of the odds-on favorite to maybe retire during Biden's time in office, because there is concern that, you know, if Biden doesn't run or doesn't win in 2024, that Breyer, if let's say he passes away or decides to retire during a Republican's time in office, he may be replaced by a conservative justice. So kind of keep an eye out that Breyer may be up for retirement, and it most likely, I can pretty much guess who the replacement justice would be, but I'll render that for later on when we talk about another justice on the Supreme Court. But kind of keep an eye that Breyer is the most odds-on favorite to decide to retire at this point. Now, the next appointee is the other Bush 43 appointee. Keep in mind, Bush 43, George W. Bush, needed to replace Sandra Day O'Connor. When Rehnquist died, Roberts moved into his position. So Samuel Alito was nominated to take over Sandra Day O'Connor's position. He is a Princeton grad, another Ivy League school, and he went to Yale Law School. So Yale is well represented on the court, and he's 70 years old. He would have been there roughly around the same time as Clarence Thomas in the hallowed halls of Yale. Both of them have very similar judicial philosophies, meaning they're the two of the most conservative members of the Supreme Court, at least consistently conservative throughout their tenure. The first of the Obama appointees, which Obama, of course, being a Democrat, you would expect them to be liberal, is Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Sotomayor is a little different in multiple facets. She went to Princeton, again, another Ivy League school, went to Yale Law. She's 66 years old. She is the first Latina on the Supreme Court. Nominated again by Obama, took over in 2009, replacing David Souter. Now, Sotomayor being there also had kind of a rough upbringing as well, whereas Clarence Thomas had issues with race. Sotomayor did too as well, but she also was raised by a single mother after her father passed away at a very young age, and kind of was raised on the streets of the Bronx. So she is, her family is from Puerto Rico, so she has a lot of ties to a number of different minority communities that are now represented by her on the Supreme Court. The other Obama appointee was Elena Kagan. Kagan, who is 60 years old, undergrad of Princeton and Oxford, and law school at Harvard. Now, she is a controversial appointee to the Supreme Court because she was never a judge before she was a justice on the Supreme Court. She was an academic. She had been a very high-priced legal authority. She had been in the legal profession for a while, but she also worked in academia. She was the president of Harvard Law School. Or the dean, I should say, of the Harvard Law School. So most of her judicial philosophy comes from academia. She has not been a judge prior to being on the Supreme Court. So it was somewhat controversial when Obama appointed her in 2010 to take over for John Paul Stevens, who had been nominated by John Paul Stevens was a nominee of Gerald Ford. So obviously everybody thought, well, that's a Republican. He should be fairly conservative. He got more liberal as he got old, which is a little different. Usually you become a tad more conservative as you get older. Stevens went in the opposite direction. So when Kagan stepped into the court and took over, it kind of was a apples to apples trade-off, if you will. And then, of course, you have, if I can get my mouse to work, there we go, the Trump appointees. Now, you'll notice by this point, we've had 3 Bush appointees, Bush 41 and Bush 43, and you have 3 Democratic or liberal judges in 1 from Clinton and 2 from Obama. So there was a 3-3 ideological tie there. Well, now you got the 3 that are from Trump. Trump had a very tumultuous 4 years, as we know, but in those 4 years, he managed to get 3 people onto the Supreme Court, not without controversy, but that's very rare for a one-term president to have 3 justices on the Supreme Court. For those of you wondering why, how could somebody, support Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of people that didn't like Donald Trump as a person, but loved the fact that he was giving them justices on the Supreme Court. So this is kind of, when you hear somebody say, well, he really came through on his promises, this is one of the promises that a die-in-the-wool conservative Republican will say Trump accomplished is that he put 3 members on the Supreme Court. The first is Neil Gorsuch. This was not without controversy. Gorsuch took over after the death of Antonin Scalia, but Scalia died during the last year of Obama's presidency. Obama nominated somebody named Merrick Garland to take that position. Merrick Garland was on the D.C. Circuit. He was, a federal judge for quite some time, had a good judicial record, but he never got an interview by the Senate. The Senate basically said, under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, at the time majority leader of the Republicans, Mitch McConnell basically said, well, we're not going to allow this to happen because basically the argument was we're not going to allow this to happen because, it's the last year of Obama and we're going to let the presidential election in 2016 decide who the next Supreme Court justice is going to be. So Garland was put on the back burner until the election. And when they elected Trump to replace Obama, the Republicans said, we're not even going to bother with Garland's appointment. We are going to wait for Trump to nominate, and Trump nominated Gorsuch. So there were a number of Democrats who felt like this was a steal, if you will. And of course, the Republicans felt that it was fair, that elections have consequences. And so it wasn't unconstitutional what they did. It may be a tad unethical, but welcome to politics. And so Gorsuch gets put on the court. He is one of the youngest members of the Supreme Court, graduate of Columbia, another Ivy League school, and he went to Harvard and Oxford. So he has both an American and British legal degree. So you're talking about a pretty academic guy, just like Kagan, on the Supreme Court. Now, the second of the appointees was controversial for a different reason. After Anthony Kennedy decided to retire, Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote on Obergefell v. Hodges, which was the gay marriage case. Brett Kavanaugh steps in as the nominee. Again, another younger justice, graduate of Yale, both in undergrad and law school, but he was controversial because during the nomination phase, he was also accused of being sexually inappropriate towards a female. And there were a number of different things that came out about him when he was a younger man, which brought the question of, do you hold these things against somebody 30 or 40 years after they happened when they weren't held against him prior to? It was, of course, a big to-do back and forth. In the end, Kavanaugh is put on the court in 2018. And of course, the most controversial of late was the last of the justices of Trump, Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a liberal on the Supreme Court. She was a Clinton appointee. And when she passed away, it was basically a couple of months before the election. So, of course, the Democrats said, well, the election is coming up. We'll wait to see what the election results are before we nominate somebody. And Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett. And McConnell said, well, no, wait, we have the Senate, so we're just going to confirm her. And, of course, the Democrats cried foul. They said, back in 2016, you make a big deal about how, hey, this isn't, we have to wait until the election. And it was basically a year. This is only a couple of months. How do you justify that? And McConnell said, well, we have the White House and we have the Senate, and that's how the Constitution works. So tough break. And they put Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. Now, of course, Democrats will always scream foul on this. But again, it goes back to, is it constitutional? Yes. What they did was constitutional. Was it ethical? Probably not. But they got away with it. So therefore, all's fair, love, and Constitution, apparently. Amy Coney Barrett will be a lifetime appointee. She is a graduate of Rhodes College, which caused kind of a minor issue with the press department for the Trump administration when they said she was a Rhodes Scholar. Not quite. Rhodes Scholar is for a scholarship over in England. This is a small school in Tennessee, but her undergraduate was in English literature. She was not even political science. Now, to her credit, she went on to law school at Notre Dame, graduated at the top of her class, and then got involved as a legal professor and is widely regarded in the legal community as having a very strong track record in academia. And when people brought up, hey, she wasn't really a judge, she hasn't really had any judicial experience, they kind of pointed to Elena Kagan and said, that wasn't a problem when Obama put her on the court, so why is it a problem here? Long story short, Amy Coney Barrett is now on the Supreme Court. She's only 49 years old. So again, if she decides, hey, I'm going to serve until death and lives till 90, then she's got 40 years on the Supreme Court. So this can have far-reaching implications. Now, why does it matter? Why does the lean matter, liberal or conservative? My argument is it does and it doesn't. For example, the Warren Court back during Eisenhower's term of office in the 50s. Earl Warren was put on the court by Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the first jobs he did was to replace the Supreme Court Chief Justice who had retired. And Earl Warren was a conservative Republican. He was a conservative Republican governor from California. Everybody thought, oh, well, he'll be a conservative Chief Justice. He ended up being fairly liberal. In fact, Eisenhower always said that was one of his biggest mistakes, was putting Earl Warren on the court. Warren was, the Warren Court is the one that put in Brown versus the Board of Education, which struck down segregation laws. They had a lot of court cases that went in favor of defendants. Miranda, Gideon, and Mapp all had to do with due process and the rights of the accused, if you will, and they found in favor of the accused. So this ended up being a fairly liberal mentality, if you will. They were replaced by the Burger Court, which was mostly Nixon appointees. So you would think, all right, Nixon, Republican, should be fairly conservative. And there were some conservative court cases for sure, but Roe v. Wade ended up being fairly liberal. Okay. So needless to say, some of these court cases are kind of, showing that they're not completely conservative. Rehnquist, Rehnquist is considered to be one of our more conservative justices and Supreme Court Chief Justices as well. But even some of his court cases ended up being fairly liberal in their tenor, if you will. And of course, Roberts Court, we talked about Obergefell v. Hodges. Obergefell v. Hodges is the gay marriage case. That was fairly liberal, and it was decided by the Roberts Court, which is supposed to be conservative, which isn't to say they don't have conservative-leaning court cases, but does this lean really matter? Now, the question I pose to you here on Google Classroom is asking, basically, do you think the lifetime appointment needs to happen? Is this something that really needs to be a lifetime appointment, or should it be limited? Should it be maybe a 10-year or a 15-year term of service? Now, granted, whichever way you go is fine. Just support yourself. And I would ask you to use something from the presentation here to support your answer. And hopefully I gave you enough that regardless of which side you are on that issue, that you have something to at least back up your argument. If you have questions about that, obviously stay behind and ask, but I'm going to turn it over now to Ficker and Ms. J so they can talk to you about your assignments.
Okay, so this week we have a couple of assignments. Get my screen here for you. All right, first one is essential Supreme Court cases. I've got a website we put together for you here. 9 cases are listed, and they're all under different categories here on the left. So first one you'll look at is Marbury versus Madison. And like all the websites we've put together, there's a link to a reading, or there is a YouTube video for you to watch. Okay, and most of these videos were put together by Bill of Rights Institute, so they have some really, really good student-friendly videos for you to take a look at. Okay, but as you're looking at those, what you want to have up is this Google Doc, and on this Google Doc, I just want you to keep track of the cases. There's a total of 9. Okay, the case name and year. What are the background facts? What's the important thing that led to this case? What did the court rule, the Supreme Court rule? And then finally, this is what you'll spend the most time on is what's so important about this ruling? Because the Supreme Court issues hundreds of about 100 decisions each term. So what makes these 9 cases more important than the other, hundreds of thousands that they have decided? Okay, so we've got federalism cases here, and you can see there's 2 there under incorporation. There's 3. Equal protection has 1, Brown versus the Board of Education, and then there's 2 election cases for you to take a look at. Okay. One of the ones that Mr. V talked about was Citizens United, and that's one you'll take a look at. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Ms. J, and she's going to go over the rest of the assignments with you.
Alrighty, so on top of those, you have 2 more assignments you're going to be doing. So you've got a assignment over the federal court system, and it's on Google Docs or Google Slides. So what you're going to do is read through the slides, and then each one has either a video or an article or both that you can look at. And then after you complete your background information on it, you're going to move to the next slide and answer the questions. So it's kind of a work your way down through the presentation. There are 7 slides total. Make sure you work all the way down to the bottom. I know sometimes on the last few questions, sometimes the answers will kind of dwindle off, but just make sure you're going through and completing all of them. They all, like I said, will have some sort of link or explanation with them. But if you have any questions about any of them, make sure you reach out and ask, and we'll be more than happy to help you out with them. And then as usual, we've got a weekly review video. So you're going to watch the video and then fill out the review chart. And then make sure when you fill out the review chart, you put some things that you understood from the video. You can write some things that you understood from the week's assignments as well. But I'm really looking for things that you understood from the video, so that way I know you watched it. Because if you wrote, I got everything, you may write that without watching it. So I don't know. So make sure you actually write some things you got while watching it. And then on the things you have questions for, it can be things you have questions for from the video, things over assignments that we did, really any question that you need help with on this unit, and we will give you new resources, videos or articles, or just another explanation, whatever we can to help you understand it a little bit better. So those are your 3 assignments for this upcoming week. And as usual, there's an assignment checklist, so you can work your way through that as well, just making sure you've got everything done. Does anyone have any questions about any of the assignments that we can answer for you?
Okay, you guys, spread the word to your classmates. I've posted this on my Google Classrooms. There's 3 weeks left in the quarter, and I think all of you are doing really well that are in our class, mine, Miss J's class. But just be aware that the end of the quarter is really, really close. It's just about 3 weeks away. So spread the word to your friends. If they have a bad grade, they got to get it in gear quickly.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out with questions. Obviously, the 3 of us are here to help. We're not here to bite your head off for not getting assignments done. We've had weird schedules. We've had weird circumstances as well. So, you know, we're going to be as understanding as we possibly can be, and as helpful as we can be. We're not here to yell at you for the situation that many of you are in. So if you're really struggling with some of this stuff, please just reach out. We're not trying to be mean or anything. We're trying to help you be successful. And we have far too many people kind of falling behind. So again, if you have any questions, stay behind. We are coming up on the hour here where you guys have to go and have lunch and get a little bit of a break in. A reminder, your 5th bell starts at 11:55. So make sure that you show up to your 5th bell on time. If you have any questions, obviously you can stay behind. You can email us or attend our office hours over the next few days. We want you to stay safe, stay healthy, stay warm. And of course, safety is a big thing if you're out driving over the next day or so, because we are going to get another round of winter weather this evening into tomorrow. So we may or may not have in-person class tomorrow. We'll see what the weather does this evening. So again, stay safe, stay healthy. If you have questions, stay behind. Otherwise, have a great day, folks.